The following segment is sponsored by Daniel A. White and Associates. It does not necessarily reflect the views of WDEL or Forever Media.
The Rick Jensen Show on 101.7 FM, 1150 AM, WDEL, and streaming to your smart speaker and mobile device.
All right, Dan White, financial planner specializing in retirement income, and I am a happy camper client, have been for many, many years. Calls in Wednesdays after the news at 1:30 with some advice and some tips for you because he studies all of this stuff, which I find sometimes quite annoying, so that we don't have to. Hi, Dan. Thanks for being on, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rick. How you doing today?
I'm all right. How you doing?
Pretty good.
I hope you didn't have a hard time getting into work with all the trees falling and the rain and everything like that.
Yeah, it was kind of nasty yesterday. Transformers and everything else blowing up. I mean, didn't lose power at home, but we lost power twice here at the office. So it was kind of bizarre.
I was out last night with my wife and a bunch of friends, and we were at a restaurant where a couple of folks are singing, and the power went off about a good dozen times. And one time it went off for a while, and I just said, "I'll take the cold salad." And people there thought it was funny, and then they laughed. But yeah, I said it's kind of like a disco. The lights go on, lights go off. Okay, and there you go. But and I totally feel for the people who still have some power out.
There's a lot. I think there's a lot still out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why some people are thinking, we're sending more spaceships to the moon, and we're sending this to Mars, and I've got no objection to that. But if we can spend money on that, how come we can't just bury cables?
Yeah, for sure.
I thought, well, because that is millions of dollars. Anyway, speaking of millions of dollars, most of us are not going to have that much when we retire. But you are absolutely, I would say, adamant about planning for retirement and doing it the right way and taking advantage of every opportunity and tool that exists. So what's your tip for today?
Today we're going to talk about what we call Peak 65 in your IRA. I came across an article, and it said, in 2024, more Americans than ever before will reach age 65. It says by this summer, 12,000 baby boomers will celebrate their 65th birthday every day. 12,000 a day. So they call this Peak 65. And if you're in this group, what does it mean for you? Well, I think that's prime time for IRA planning. I think between the age of 59 and a half and the age of 73, when you're required to start taking money out, you have more tax flexibility than ever before. So it's a prime time to do planning with your IRA. When you reach age 59 and a half, the 10% early distribution penalty becomes history, so you can take distributions from your IRA for any reason at all and not worry about a penalty. And now you still got to pay taxes, but the early distribution penalty is gone at that point. And on the flip side, at age 65, you're not required to take any money out from your IRA if you don't want it or need it. But at age 73, we know that's no longer the case because then required minimum distributions kick in. So you're in that window of opportunity where you can take money out of your IRA to spend it, to do whatever you want with it. But a couple things you want to be aware of. With tax reform, tax rates, again, are at historic lows for another 2 years. It might make sense to take IRA distributions now to take advantage of the low rates because no one knows what the future rates will be when your RMDs are required. The second thing, it's also a great time to consider Roth conversions because you can convert your IRA now at today's low tax rates and eliminate any future worries about your required minimum distributions because you're not required to take RMDs from the Roth anytime during your lifetime. Now, with a Roth conversion, there is a tax bill, and you need to be aware of the stealth taxes like the Medicare IRMA surtax. But conversion is a one-time event. The trade-off is you get tax-free earnings for you and your beneficiaries for the rest of your life. So Peak 65 is a great time to take a look at it, look at your retirement accounts from a planning standpoint and see from a tax standpoint if you can't do some moves that'll make it more tax efficient.
All right. Dan White, by the way, you can always reach Dan at 888-690-8820, 888-690-8820. Great guy. I use Dan. I use you, man. I'm just using you. I was going to say I used Dan for years, but I have you. Dan and I worked together for years and years and years, and I always appreciate your advice. It's always been quite helpful. So in listening to this, I'm wondering, some people are just, like to be all in the market. Some people all in secure investments. And folks like myself, I like a mix of all that sort of thing.
Sure.
So you talk about taking the hit right now out of the IRA, and the expectation is that when you're retiring, you'll be in a lower tax bracket, but also earning more right now. So if you're in like interest-bearing accounts, for example, not the market, and right now you can, I guess in money markets, they're anywhere from 3% to 5.5%. You can get the insured contracts, and they're like 10% with a bonus and such. So there are a lot of different things you can do. But I'm wondering, and let's say someone's got $500,000, $500,000 retirement,
right,
and they're going to have to pay taxes on that. But you think, well, yeah, but you want to get that money back if you possibly can. And how should you be thinking about that when you realize, wow, that's an enormous tax hit on that money? And
I don't think you look at it from doing, bite off the whole apple. This is where partial Roth conversions come into play, and where this becomes relevant, Rick, is you look at the tax brackets. So depending upon, I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a married couple and they're living on $5,000 a month or $60,000 a year. They may or may not be aware they can go up to almost $120,000 of taxable income, and they're still going to be in a 12% bracket. So if they're only living on $60,000 and they got $500,000 in retirement assets, they could do a $60,000 Roth conversion. They'll pay 12% or about $7,000 in taxes, but that's the last tax dollar the government will ever see out of that money. They're paying it. They're paying the tax at 12%. It's not going to affect them from a Medicare standpoint. As opposed to they do the whole 500, they're going to kick themselves probably up into a 32 or a 34% bracket. Don't do that. You don't want to be paying the high rates, but you want to fill up the brackets and capture the low rates if you can.
That's another thing, too. I listen to you guys. You're experts on Medicare as well. So somebody's retired, or maybe they're working and they get Medicare, and it could be as low as like $150 a month or something like that. I don't know the numbers exactly, but if you exceed some of these income brackets, my God, it could be $500-$600 a month you're paying, and you don't realize all of a sudden that it's a huge expense, right?
Yeah, that's true, and you got to be cognizant of that. So, and when you're talking about Roth conversion strategies, you got to be cognizant of it too, because again, that's going to add to your taxable income. And if you're doing partials, it may not have an impact. But again, you have to be careful with how much you're actually going to convert, because it might kick you up into one of those brackets where you're paying more for your Medicare premium.
Let me ask you about how you feel right today, as you do, because I want people to know Dan studies the markets. He's on a lot of different sides. He studies the money supplies, the M1, the M2 money. How many people have money in money markets. Money market funds and things like that. Exactly. And we're seeing some shortages in this M2 money. The M2 money is savings and checking, but also money market funds as well. And researchers are saying there's actually a decrease in that amount of money. So they're kind of concerned about the markets that may or may not be an indication of some sort of level of recession. What do you think is going to happen with, for example, these money market funds and other interest-bearing accounts if indeed the Fed lowers the interest rate this year?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking the same thing. If the Fed lowers rates, your money market funds and your fixed instruments are all going to go down. From a money supply standpoint, yeah, we are seeing a slowdown in the velocity of money, the M1. Which usually says credit is getting tighter, which we know it has. I mean, mortgage rates have gone from 2, 3 to up to 7, north of 7%. So we know credit's getting tighter, and the velocity of money is slowing down, and that usually does lead to a recession. So that's just another sign. You got the inverted yield curve, you've got a whole lot of things that are pointing to recession, and yet the American economy has been very resilient. Unemployment is still traditionally low, and GDP is still coming in. So we've been able to weather the storm so far, and the Fed is really desperately trying to engineer this so-called soft landing. Whether they can pull it off or not remains to be seen, but the signs are there that a recession might be on the horizon.
Dan, when we look at these employment numbers, we recognize the fact that there are millions of people who are actually staying afloat by having second jobs. And I've seen different estimates of the percentage. It could be 6%, it could be 13% of Americans who are doing this, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, things like that. So when we talk about recession, I know that there have been predictions of a recession since the end of 2020, in 2021, since the $1,400 checks went out. Yeah, exactly. And I think we had, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, we only had like 2 quarters of consecutive negative gross domestic product.
Negative growth, yeah.
Yeah, so, that would be indication of a recession. But it seems like it was more technical than anything else because inflation's hurting people more. Do you believe, like today, that, we actually could be seeing a recession, or is it going to be these concerns that don't really play out to a bad recession that we've seen in the last, really, 2.5 years?
It's funny because I think late in the year the market shot up because the Fed minutes were released and they were talking about 3 rate cuts, going into 2024. And my opinion is the Fed, I've been hearing for a long time, higher for longer. They're going to keep interest rates higher for longer than we think. And then they came out with this tone that they're going to have 3 rate cuts this year. Keep in mind the Fed will probably only cut rates if the economy is in trouble. They're not going to cut rates if everything is strong. If unemployment is low and inflation's under control, they're certainly not going to cut rates. There's no reason to. But if the stock market goes into a tizzy, and again, they're supposed to be independent of the stock market, their goal is not to keep the stock market propped up, but it is an election year.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So you never know. But if the stock market starts to really tank, the first thing the Fed will do is, hey, maybe we ought to cut interest rates. So it remains to be seen when they're going to cut. I mean, they were projecting, the first one in March. I think it's flip a coin whether they're going to cut or not. It really depends on the economic indicators going forward.
I also wonder if insurance companies and banks have invested in enough long-term, and I don't know if they're looking at like not just 3 or 5-term. 5-year instruments, not just bonds, but other financial instruments. I wonder if they're investing in enough long-term, like 20, 30-year, certainly not the ones that don't expire ever, but I wonder if they're investing enough long-term that if the Fed does reduce the interest rates by, let's say, 25 basis points or something, that they can continue to pay the 4%, the 5%. I'm seeing 4.5%, 5.5% at some of these online banks, especially. And I wonder if they could still be competitive that way, or if they would be compelled to reduce the interest rate.
Yeah, most of the time it's shorter term money, and they will react fairly quickly. And it was really interesting when the rates were going up. People, back then, again with the inverted yield curve, you were getting more yield on a shorter-term product than you were a longer-term product, which, again, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But people were like, hey, let's lock in a 3-year rather than a 5-year. You're talking a 10 basis point difference. They may come back to haunt people because, again, if the Fed starts cutting rates, you might have said, oh, maybe I should have locked in the 5-year because now rates are a full point, 2 points lower than where I was, So it remains to be seen. But usually if they start cutting rates, the majority of short-term rates will start coming down.
I'm going to throw something else out there that I don't want you to comment on because I know you can't really talk about securities. It might sound like a recommendation about a particular security. But I saw something out there that I thought was interesting, and I'm really apprehensive. I don't think I would do it. But there are companies, and there's one that are on the market, that are making loans to businesses that are struggling. And the concept is that if their customer base is diverse enough, like they have hundreds and hundreds of clients, that they could continue to pay a high interest rate. I saw one that's paying 10%. And what they do is they loan money out to these businesses that are struggling, and the company says, oh, okay, well, we think these guys are going to be able to survive, and we're going to loan them money at a high interest rate, and it pays investors, less regular folks like me or whoever else, 10%. And I saw that, and I thought, okay, but that's great, but even if they lose, like, say, 20% or they go under, 30% or under, they can still pay, maybe not to 10%, maybe 8%, and they're still doing well. But, man, as everything's changing, I'm thinking that's got to be one of the riskiest things to do.
It's kind of interesting, Rick. There was a group, I want to go back a couple years, but it was called Par Funding. And this was exactly what you were talking about. They were doing a lot of advertising on different radios and TVs and saying like 10 to 12% interest rates. And this was back when interest rates were near zero. In this group, they raised over $550 million from 2010 to 2020. And it was basically exactly what you talked about. It was a loan sharking operation.
Oh, wow.
Basically, yeah, they loaned the same thing. They were loaning out money to people at like 15, 20%, businesses that couldn't get traditional funding. And then COVID hit. And all of a sudden nobody's paying any of these loans back. And now some of their investors were like, hey, I want to get some of my money. The whole thing blew up. It was kind of a Ponzi scheme. And I even had clients call us back then like, oh, these guys are offering 11%. I'm like, well, think about it. If everybody's paying 1% and these guys are offering 11, does it sound too good to be true?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you got to, it's basically an unsecured note is what it is.
Understood. So. Dan White, financial planner specializing in retirement income. I'm a happy client, have been for years, and will continue. Also host On the Money here on WDEL, Sunday mornings at 7 o'clock. What's the coffee and bagel talk this Sunday?
Well, this Sunday, I've often been accused, Rick, of being kind of a perma bear. I'm always telling people what to be watchful for and be, hope for the best but plan for the worst.
Yeah.
So I figured we'd start the new year off on a bright note and say, let's look at all the good news as 2024 begins. So we're going to kind of give you an upbeat show to start the year, and hopefully it will continue. But we better be a little careful heading into 2024.
I want good news. I'm looking forward to some good news, Dan. All right, Dan White, danwhiteandassociates.com, because I got on the internet way too soon, didn't realize that's a lot of typing, danwhiteandassociates.com. Also, 888-690-8820, 888-690-8820. Give the guy a call. He won't charge you anything just to take a look at what you're doing. All right, my friend. Be well.
Have a great day, Rick.
All right, and pitchers and catchers, just a few weeks now. All right, thanks, Dan.